The morning of August 17, 1943, 26,000 feet above Regensburg, Germany. Hauptmann Fritz Geischardt, commander of the 3rd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26, adjusted his oxygen mask and squinted through the armoured glass of his Messerschmitt Bf 109. Ahead, silhouetted against the bright summer sky, a formation of American bombers maintained their steady, inexorable course toward the Messerschmitt aircraft factory below. Geischardt was not a novice. He had flown combat missions since the Spanish Civil War. He knew bombers. He understood their vulnerabilities, their blind spots, the precise angle of attack that would bring them down with minimal risk to himself. The Americans called these aircraft flying fortresses, a grandiose name that suggested invulnerability. But every fortress had its weak points, and Geischardt had studied them all. He pushed his throttle forward and dove toward the formation. His wingmen followed in tight formation, their propellers carving through the thin air. The plan was textbook. A high-speed pass through the bomber stream, cannon fire concentrated on the engines and cockpit, then break away before the defensive gunners could track his fighter. He had executed this maneuver dozens of times, but something was different this time. As Geischardt closed to firing range, the nose of the lead bomber erupted with muzzle flashes, not the scattered, ineffective fire he had come to expect, but a concentrated wall of tracer rounds that seemed to fill the entire sky between his fighter and its target. He felt impacts hammering against his aircraft's fuselage. Then, a searing pain in his abdomen. Blood, hot and sticky, soaked through his flight suit. Geischardt managed to break off the attack and nurse his damaged fighter to a landing at Ghent airfield in Belgium. Medical personnel rushed to the aircraft, but the wound was severe. Despite their efforts, Hauptmann Fritz Geischardt died early the Peterlevarings. Next morning, not in aerial combat with enemy fighters, but from defensive fire returned by a bomber he had been sent to destroy. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This death, one among thousands in the strategic air campaign over Europe, represented something more significant than the loss of a skilled pilot. It marked the collision of doctrine with reality, of assumption with evidence. The Luftwaffe had built its bomber fleet and trained its fighter pilots based on a fundamental belief about aerial warfare, that bombers were targets, instruments of delivery for explosives, defended primarily through speed, maneuverability, and fighter escort. Defensive armament was secondary, almost an afterthought. The Americans had built their air force on an entirely different premise, and by the summer of 1943, German pilots were learning this difference, in the most brutal way possible, through death, injury, and the steady, grinding attrition of their fighter squadrons. To understand how the Luftwaffe arrived at this fatal miscalculation, we must return to the mid-1930s, when the world's major powers were rebuilding their air forces in the shadow of the Great War and the spectre of the next conflict everyone knew was coming. In Germany, the newly formed Luftwaffe, under Hermann Göring's command, developed its bomber doctrine through a combination of theoretical study and practical experience. The service's first chief of staff, General Walther Wever, had argued for a broadly based air strategy that included the possibility of strategic bombing using 4-engine heavy bombers. Wever understood that the Luftwaffe should be capable of striking deep into enemy territory, destroying industrial capacity, and breaking civilian morale. But Wever died in an aircraft accident in June 1936, and with him died the Luftwaffe's commitment to strategic bombing. His successors, Albert Kesselring and Ernst Udet, believed that Germany's air power should focus on supporting ground forces in rapid, decisive campaigns. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Fast, maneuverable medium bombers would strike at enemy airfields, supply lines, and troop concentrations just ahead of advancing German ground forces. Fighter aircraft would establish air superiority over the battlefield and protect the bombers during their missions. This doctrine had profound implications for bomber design. If bombers would operate primarily within range of friendly fighter escort and against tactical targets, they did not need heavy defensive armament. Speed and agility would be their primary defense. The Heinkel He 111, which became the most numerous Luftwaffe bomber in the early war years, was designed around these principles. In its early variants, the aircraft carried just three 7.92mm machine guns, one in the nose, one in a dorsal position, and one in a ventral position operated from a retractable dustbin-style turret. The crew consisted of 5 men, but only 3 had any gunnery duties, and these were secondary to their primary roles, as bombardier, radio operator, or navigator. The Dornier Du-17, nicknamed the Flying Pencil for its narrow fuselage, followed similar design philosophy. Initially conceived as a fast mail plane, it was converted into a bomber when Deutsche Lufthansa rejected it for commercial service. The military version typically carried between 4 and 6 7.92mm MG-15 machine guns in various positions around the aircraft. Its defensive armament was considered adequate because the aircraft's primary defense was its speed, which in the mid-1930s could outpace many contemporary fighters. The third major German bomber, the Junkers Ju-88, entered service as the Luftwaffe's most modern design. Even this aircraft, despite being faster and more capable than its predecessors, carried only 6 flexible MG-81 machine guns. These weapons were manned by crew members who had other primary duties. The bombardier served as front gunner, the radio operator as rear gunner, the navigator operated the ventral gun position. This pattern of minimal defensive armament reflected a consistent philosophy. Bombers succeeded through operational doctrine, not through firepower. The MG-15, the standard flexible defensive weapon on German bombers, fired the 7.92 by 57mm round, the same cartridge used in the standard German infantry rifle. While this was one of the more powerful rifle-caliber rounds in military service, by 1940 any rifle-caliber weapon struggled to inflict critical damage on modern, well-constructed fighter aircraft with armor plating protecting the pilot and engine. The Luftwaffe's doctrine appeared vindicated during the early campaigns of World War II. In Poland, in September 1939, German bombers operated with near impunity, their missions protected by overwhelming fighter superiority and the rapid collapse of Polish resistance. In Norway and Denmark in April 1940, and then in France and the Low Countries in May and June, the same pattern held. German bombers struck tactical targets, German fighters swept enemy aircraft from the skies, and the Wehrmacht's ground forces exploited the chaos created by air attack. But the Battle of Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940 exposed the fatal flaw in this doctrine. When German bombers attempted to operate over England without adequate fighter escort, either because the Bf-109 lacked sufficient range to accompany them throughout the mission, or because the twin-engine Bf-110 heavy fighter proved unable to survive against more agile single-engine interceptors, they suffered catastrophic losses. On August 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its largest coordinated attack of the battle, striking targets across southern England. German bombers discovered that their defensive armament was woefully inadequate against determined attack by modern, heavily armed monoplane fighters like the Hurricane and Spitfire. The Dornier Du-17, despite its agility and the rugged reliability of its air-cooled radial engines, could not maneuver well enough to evade fighters while maintaining formation and delivering accurate bombing. The Heinkel He-111, structurally tough and capable of absorbing tremendous punishment, was nonetheless slow and poorly armed. In one particularly devastating attack on August 18 against RAF Kenley Airfield, 9 Dornier Du-17s from 9 Staffelkampfgeschwader 76 were either shot down or damaged so severely they never flew combat operations again. The Luftwaffe responded by increasing defensive armament on its bombers. Additional MG-15 machine guns were installed in beam positions, in the tail cone, anywhere that might provide coverage against attacking fighters. Some aircraft received the more powerful 13mm MG-131 machine gun. A few were even fitted with 20mm MG-FF cannons in the nose or ventral positions. But these measures were retrofits, field modifications, attempts to patch a fundamental design deficiency. The basic airframe and crew positions had not been designed around heavy defensive armament, and the additions came at the cost of performance, reducing already inadequate speed and maneuverability. By the time the Battle of Britain ended in October 1940, the Luftwaffe's bomber force had been mauled. The strategic bombing campaign against Britain had failed, not because German bombers lacked the range or payload capacity to damage British industry, but because they could not survive in daylight against modern fighter opposition without overwhelming escort. And in the years that followed, as the Luftwaffe committed ever more of its resources to the invasion of the Soviet Union and the defense of occupied territories across Europe and North Africa, the opportunity to fundamentally redesign the bomber force around different principles never materialized. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American aircraft designers had been developing bombers based on an entirely different set of assumptions. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress began as Boeing's Model 299, a private venture by the company to meet a U.S. Army Air Corps requirement for a multi-engine bomber. When the prototype first flew in July 1935, it was one of the most advanced aircraft in the world, an all-metal, low-wing monoplane with 4 engines, a retractable undercarriage, and an enclosed flight deck. But what captured the imagination of journalists and military officials alike was its defensive armament. The prototype carried 5 Browning machine guns in various positions around the aircraft, an unprecedented number for a bomber of that era. A reporter at the aircraft's public unveiling coined the term "flying fortress," and Boeing immediately adopted it for marketing purposes. 5 machine guns. In 1935, this was considered extraordinary, even excessive. Most bombers of the period carried 2 or 3 defensive weapons. The 5-gun armament reflected a specific doctrine being developed by theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School at Maxwell Field, Alabama. These theorists faced a fundamental problem. The United States, protected by 2 oceans, would need to project military power across vast distances in any future conflict. Bombers would need to strike targets deep in enemy territory, far beyond the range of any escort fighter, then in service or under development. If bombers could not be escorted, they would have to defend themselves. And if they had to defend themselves, they would need heavy armament and the ability to fly in mutually supporting formations. The doctrine that emerged held that bombers in tight formation, with overlapping fields of fire from their defensive weapons, could create a zone of destruction through which enemy fighters would be unable to penetrate without suffering unacceptable losses. The theory was elegant. The reality would prove far more complex, but the doctrine shaped every subsequent design decision for American heavy bombers. The initial B-17 models that entered service in 1937 and 1938 were, by later standards, lightly armed. The B-17B carried 5 Browning machine guns, but 2 of these were rifle-caliber 30-caliber weapons with limited effectiveness against armoured targets. As international tensions increased and war broke out in Europe, the Air Corps recognized the need for heavier armament. The B-17C, of which 38 were built, replaced the rifle-caliber guns with 50-caliber Browning M2 heavy machine guns. This half-inch caliber weapon, originally developed as an anti-tank rifle in the final year of the First World War, had evolved into one of the most effective aircraft weapons ever created. Its heavy bullet retained lethal energy at long range, could penetrate light armor, and had a reasonable rate of fire. But even the B-17C, with its 5 50-caliber guns, had significant defensive blind spots. The nose was defended by a single flexible gun operated by the bombardier. The tail, the most critical position for defending against the standard stern attack used by fighter pilots, had only a single gun in a manually operated mount. When the British Royal Air Force took delivery of 20 B-17Cs in 1941 for high-altitude daylight operations against German targets, they discovered these defensive inadequacies the hard way. German fighters found that attacking from directly ahead or astern offered the best chance of success. The RAF quickly abandoned daylight operations and transferred the aircraft to Coastal Command for maritime patrol duties. The Americans learned from British experience. The B-17E model, which entered production in September 1941, represented a fundamental redesign of the aircraft's defensive armament. The tailgun position was replaced with a powered turret mounting twin 50-caliber machine guns, dramatically improving the gunner's field of fire and rate of engagement. A new dorsal turret behind the cockpit, also mounting twin 50-caliber guns, protected the upper rear quadrant. A ball turret, suspended from the fuselage, provided coverage of the vulnerable belly. Additional single guns were positioned at waist windows on either side of the fuselage and in the radio compartment. The total armament had increased to 9 50-caliber machine guns, each weapon capable of firing 750 rounds per minute to an effective range of more than half a mile. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the doctrine of the self-defending bomber formation remained untested by sustained combat. The first American heavy bomber missions from England didn't begin until August 1942, and even then they were shallow penetrations of occupied France, heavily escorted by RAF Spitfires. German fighter opposition was limited. American losses were light. It appeared the doctrine might work. But as American bomber missions penetrated deeper into German-controlled territory, beyond the range of escort fighters, the Luftwaffe began to mass its defensive fighters for concentrated attacks. German pilots, veterans of years of combat in multiple theaters, quickly identified the tactical situation. They faced heavily armed bombers flying in formation, but these bombers were alone, without fighter protection. It was a target-rich environment. All they had to do was find the best approach to maximize damage while minimizing risk. They found it in the head-on attack. The logic was simple. Most of the B-17's defensive armament pointed to the sides or rear. The nose had only a single flexible gun operated by the bombardier, who was simultaneously trying to navigate, manage his bomb sight, and return fire. The forward armor protection was lighter than at the rear, designed primarily to protect against flak fragments rather than direct fighter attack. And a head-on attack compressed the engagement time to just seconds, giving the bomber's gunners minimal opportunity to track and engage the attacking fighter. Luftwaffe pilots discovered that 4 or 5 well-placed 20mm cannon hits from directly ahead could destroy a B-17. The explosive shells could penetrate the nose glazing, killing the bombardier and navigator. They could strike the pilots, who sat directly behind the nose and above it. They could damage the engines or ignite fuel tanks in the wings, and, because the bomber and fighter were approaching each other at a combined speed, often exceeding 600 miles per hour, the actual time in the bomber's defensive fire was just 1 or 2 seconds. Of course, this tactic required extraordinary nerve. A pilot diving toward a formation of heavy bombers, with tracers streaming toward his cockpit, had to maintain precise aim, while his every instinct screamed at him to break away. Many pilots, especially less experienced ones, broke off their attacks too early, wasting ammunition and reducing the effectiveness of their pass. But skilled pilots, veterans with dozens of missions, could execute the head-on attack with devastating effect. Throughout the spring and summer of 1943, American bomber losses mounted. The raid on Schweinfurt on August 17th, the same mission during which Hauptmann Geischardt was killed, cost the 8th Air Force 36 B-17s out of 183 dispatched. A loss rate of nearly 20%. The simultaneous raid on Regensburg lost 24 more bombers. The second Schweinfurt raid on October 14th cost another 60 B-17s. These losses were unsustainable. At such attrition rates, every bomber crew would be dead or captured before completing the 25-mission tour required to return home. The Americans faced a strategic crisis. The entire doctrine of daylight precision bombing, the justification for building the vast armada of heavy bombers now gathering in England, depended on the ability to reach and destroy targets deep in German territory. But without fighter escort for the entire mission, bombers were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced, and crews were dying faster than they could be trained. The solution came in 2 forms, and both reflected the fundamental American approach to industrial warfare: apply resources until the problem is solved. First, bomber defensive armament would be increased yet again. The B-17F model had added cheek guns in the nose, single 50-caliber weapons aimed forward from windows on either side of the bombardier's position. These helped, but they were manually aimed, difficult to operate effectively, and provided only limited coverage. What was needed was a powered turret in the nose, something that could be aimed and fired quickly, that provided protection against the devastating head-on attacks that were destroying so many aircraft. Boeing engineers, working with Bendix Corporation, developed a remotely operated chin turret that could be installed beneath the bombardier's position, mounting two 50-caliber machine guns with 1,460 rounds of ammunition. Combined with the existing cheek guns, this gave the nose of the aircraft four forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns, transforming the previously vulnerable position into a formidable defensive strongpoint. The modified aircraft, designated the B-17G, began reaching England in the late summer of 1943. With the addition of the chin turret, the aircraft now carried 13 50-caliber machine guns, 2 in the chin turret, 2 in the top turret, 2 in the ball turret, 2 in the tail turret, 1 in each cheek position, 1 in the radio room, and 1 at each waist window. Nearly 7,500 rounds of ammunition fed these weapons. Every crew member except the pilot and co-pilot had a gun at his station, 13 guns, each capable of firing 12.5 rounds per second, each round weighing nearly 2 ounces and travelling at 2,900 feet per second at the muzzle. The mathematical firepower was staggering. At maximum rate, a single B-17G could theoretically fire over 9,000 rounds per minute, although in practice the rate was much lower due to the need to aim, the limited ammunition supply at each position, and the physical difficulty of operating the weapons in combat conditions. But the psychological impact was more significant than the mathematical firepower. Every fifth round in the ammunition belt was a tracer, a bullet with a small pyrotechnic charge in its base that ignited upon firing and burned brightly as the round flew downrange. The tracer served 2 purposes. It allowed the gunner to observe where his rounds were going so he could adjust his aim, and it provided a visible deterrent to attacking fighters. The stream of tracers created an illusion of far more rounds in the air than actually existed, since for every glowing tracer, 4 invisible bullets accompanied it. German fighter pilots, closing at high speed on a B-17 formation, found themselves flying into what appeared to be a solid wall of fire. Hundreds of tracer rounds, glowing red or orange, seemed to fill every cubic meter of air between them and their targets. The natural human response was to flinch, to break away, to avoid flying through that inferno. And even pilots who fought for themselves to maintain their attack runs often broke off early, reducing their engagement time and their accuracy. The defensive armament didn't need to destroy every attacking fighter. It only needed to make the attack costly enough, dangerous enough, that pilots would either abort their runs early or avoid attacking the formation altogether. In this role, the 13 guns of the B-17G proved remarkably effective, not through the mechanical act of shooting down fighters, but through the psychological pressure they exerted on the men trying to shoot down the bombers. When a captured B-17F was examined by Luftwaffe intelligence officers in 1942, they counted 11 heavy machine guns. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, State Secretary for the Luftwaffe and one of the architects of German rearmament, recognized immediately the implications. Here was a bomber designed not merely to carry bombs but to fight its way through enemy air defenses. Milch warned his superiors that these aircraft represented a serious threat to German cities and industry. But Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, dismissed the concern. German fighters, he argued, could handle any bomber the Americans might produce. By the time the B-17G entered service with its 13 guns, that confidence had begun to erode. Adolf Galland, General of Fighter Aircraft and one of the Luftwaffe's most successful aces, observed that the B-17 united every possible advantage in one aircraft: heavy armor, enormous altitude capability, colossal defensive armament, and great speed relative to other bombers. It was, he concluded, a formidable opponent, but the German response to this threat was constrained by the fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Luftwaffe's situation. To effectively engage B-17 formations, German fighters needed heavier armament, 30mm cannons that could destroy a bomber with just a few hits, allowing the attacking fighter to stay outside the effective range of the bomber's defensive guns. But heavier armament meant heavier aircraft, which meant reduced performance, which made German fighters more vulnerable to American escort fighters that were now beginning to appear over Germany. The Focke-Wulf 190A, one of the Luftwaffe's best fighters, was progressively up-armed from two 20mm cannons to 4, then 6, then supplemented with 30mm weapons. Special Sturmbock or assault versions were created specifically for attacking bomber formations, with armor plating to protect the pilot from defensive fire and heavy cannon armament. But these heavily armed and armored fighters were slower and less maneuverable than standard models, making them easy prey for American P-47s, and later P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe found itself trapped in an arms race it was losing. Each increase in bomber defensive armament drove German fighters to carry heavier weapons. Heavier weapons made German fighters more vulnerable to American escorts. More vulnerability meant higher losses, which meant fewer fighters available, which meant less protection for German industry and cities. The strategic situation, which had seemed so favorable in 1940 when the Luftwaffe ranged freely over Europe, had completely reversed by late 1943. The human cost of this defensive firepower, magnificent as it appeared in training films and propaganda footage, was extracted in ways that statistics and armament lists could never capture. The 13 guns of a B-17G were not fired by 13 dedicated gunners. They were operated by 10 men, most of whom had multiple responsibilities, and all of whom endured conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Consider the ball turret gunner, perhaps the most iconic and certainly one of the most miserable positions on any aircraft of the war. The Sperry ball turret was a marvel of engineering. A sphere of metal and plexiglass, approximately 4 feet in diameter, suspended from the belly of the aircraft by a motorized support that allowed 360 degrees of rotation. Inside this sphere, the gunner crouched in a fetal position, his knees drawn up to his chest, his feet in stirrups that controlled the turret's movement, his hands on the firing controls for two 50-caliber machine guns with 500 rounds each. The ball turret gunner entered his position after takeoff, climbing down through a hatch in the fuselage floor and contorting himself into the cramped space. He remained there for the duration of the mission, which could last 8 hours or more. There was no room to move, no way to stretch cramped muscles. The plexiglass glazing offered minimal protection against the cold at altitude, where temperatures regularly dropped to 60 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. The electrically heated suits that crews wore often malfunctioned, shorting out, and sometimes burning the wearer, or failing entirely and leaving the gunner to slowly freeze. But the psychological burden was perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. The ball turret gunner hung beneath the aircraft, unable to see his crewmates, connected only by the intercom system. If that system failed, he was alone in silence, watching the earth far below and the enemy fighters that rose to attack. If the aircraft was damaged and forced to make an emergency landing, there was often no time to rotate the turret to allow the gunner to exit. Aircraft that belly landed with the ball turret extended crushed the gunner inside. Every man who flew in that position knew this risk. Every mission involved placing himself in a position from which escape might be impossible. The waist gunners, positioned at windows on either side of the fuselage, faced different challenges. These positions were not enclosed. The windows were open to allow the guns to be aimed, which meant they were open to the frigid air at altitude. Wind roared through the fuselage at over 200 miles per hour, carrying away heat and making every breath an icy assault on the lungs. The gunners wore oxygen masks, heavy flight suits, electrically heated underwear, gloves so thick they could barely feel the gun's triggers. And as they fired, the spent brass casings from their weapons piled up on the deck beneath them, creating a slippery, hazardous surface that could cause a man to lose his footing at a critical moment. The top turret gunner, positioned directly behind and above the pilots, had an enclosed turret that offered some protection from the elements. But his position required constant vigilance, scanning the sky above and to the sides of the aircraft for the German fighters that dove from the sun or lurked in clouds before attacking. The physical act of operating the turret, traversing it rapidly to track fast-moving targets while simultaneously aiming and firing, was exhausting. Missions could last 8 hours. For 8 hours, the gunner had to remain alert, ready, because the attack could come at any moment and might last only seconds. The tail gunner occupied what many considered the most important defensive position on the aircraft. The tail of the bomber, where the fuselage narrowed and offered limited protection, was the traditional point of attack for fighter pilots. A gunner positioned here could engage fighters as they made their approach runs, potentially driving them off or destroying them before they could inflict critical damage. But this position, like the ball turret, was isolating. The tail gunner crawled through a narrow passage from the main fuselage into the tail section, where he knelt before his twin 50 caliber guns and a small window of plexiglass that was often the only thing between him and oblivion. If the tail was shot away, as sometimes happened, there was no escape. The gunner simply ceased to exist. The most vulnerable positions, ironically, were in the nose, where the bombardier and navigator worked. The bombardier sat at the very front of the aircraft, surrounded by plexiglass, with an unobstructed view ahead and below. His primary job was to operate the Norden bomb sight, the sophisticated optical mechanical computer that calculated the precise moment to release bombs for maximum accuracy. But he was also responsible for operating the chin turret in the B-17G models and for firing one of the cheek guns during combat. When German fighters attacked head-on, the bombardier had seconds to abandon his bombing calculations, swing the chin turret toward the threat, and return fire while shells and bullets smashed through the plexiglass around him. The navigator sat just behind the bombardier, at a small table where he plotted the aircraft's course using dead reckoning, radio navigation aids, and visual landmarks when available. He, too, had a cheek gun to operate during combat. Both officers for the bombardier and navigator were commissioned officers. Unlike the enlisted gunners, were exposed to enemy fire with minimal protection. Many bomber missions resulted in the bombardier or navigator, or both, being killed or severely wounded by the first burst of fire from a head-on attack. The pilots and co-pilot, seated side by side on the flight deck above and behind the nose, had somewhat better protection. Armor plate behind their seats protected against attacks from the rear. The instruments and structure of the aircraft provided some shielding, but they too were vulnerable, especially to head-on attacks, and they bore the additional burden of command. The pilot had to maintain formation, navigate through flak, make split-second decisions about whether to continue to the target or abort if damage was too severe, and do all of this while watching his friends and comrades in other aircraft explode or spin away trailing fire. And the radio operator, positioned amidships with a single gun in the upper fuselage, served as the crew's link to the outside world, monitoring communications, calling out threats, and adding his own firepower to the defensive barrage when fighters closed in. 10 men. 13 guns. An aircraft that weighed 30,000 pounds empty and up to 65,000 pounds loaded with fuel, bombs, and ammunition. This was the weapon system the Americans had created to execute daylight precision bombing against the most heavily defended targets in Europe. The question that haunted every crew, on every mission, was whether it would be enough. The answer, as revealed through the brutal arithmetic of combat, was both yes and no. Yes, the defensive armament made B-17 formations a formidable challenge for German fighters. The claim by bomber gunners of enemy aircraft destroyed reached extraordinary numbers. The 8th Air Force credited its bomber gunners with 6,259 German fighters shot down, more than were credited to the 8th Air Force's fighter pilots. But the methodology for confirming these kills was problematic. In the chaos of combat, with multiple gunners often firing at the same target, it was nearly impossible to determine who had actually destroyed a particular fighter. Many claims were certainly duplicates. Others represented fighters that were damaged but not destroyed, that managed to limp home and fight another day. Post-war examination of German records revealed that actual losses were far lower than the claims suggested. On the first Schweinfurt raid in August 1943, American gunners claimed 228 German fighters destroyed. Careful analysis by the 8th Air Force staff reduced this to between 100 and 148. The actual German loss, documented in Luftwaffe records, was 25 fighters. This enormous discrepancy didn't mean the gunners were lying or that their fire was ineffective. It meant that combat was chaos, that identifying results was nearly impossible, and that the psychological pressure of defensive fire was far more significant than the physical destruction it caused. German fighters didn't need to be destroyed to be driven off. They only needed to be discouraged, to have their attacks disrupted, to be forced to break off early or avoid certain approach angles entirely. In this psychological role, the defensive armament succeeded brilliantly. German pilots, even experienced aces, described the experience of attacking B-17 formations with a mixture of professional respect and visceral fear. One pilot compared it to making love to a porcupine that was on fire, a crude but vivid description of the seemingly impossible task of closing to effective weapons range while tracer rounds streamed past the cockpit. Another pilot noted that the size of the bombers and their formations could not be adequately described to inexperienced pilots. They had to be experienced firsthand to be understood. The Luftwaffe developed increasingly sophisticated tactics to counter the bombers' defensive fire. Fighters attacked in coordinated waves, attempting to overwhelm the gunners and divide their attention. They launched rockets from outside the effective range of the 50 caliber guns, hoping to break up formations or destroy bombers without having to press home close-range attacks. They deployed specially trained Sturmgruppen, assault groups of heavily armed and armoured fighters that would bore through defensive fire to get close enough for their 30mm cannons to be effective, accepting higher losses in exchange for higher kill rates. But every tactical innovation had a cost. Rockets were inaccurate and required carrying heavy launch rails that degraded fighter performance. Sturmgruppen tactics resulted in devastating losses when American escort fighters caught the slow, heavily laden assault fighters before they could reach the bombers. Coordinated attacks required communications, training, and leadership that became increasingly scarce as experienced pilots were killed, and German pilot training programs were compressed to rush replacements to combat units. By early 1944, the strategic balance had shifted decisively. The appearance of long-range American escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang with drop tanks that gave it the range to accompany bombers all the way to Berlin and back, transformed the air war over Germany. Now German fighters had to fight through American escorts to reach the bombers, and if they did reach the bombers, they still faced the wall of defensive fire from formations that had only grown larger and more numerous. The Big Week Offensive in February 1944 demonstrated the new reality. In a series of coordinated raids against German aircraft production facilities, the 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command sent thousands of bombers protected by hundreds of escort fighters deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe attempted to defend, throwing every available fighter into combat. The Germans inflicted significant losses on the attacking bombers, but they suffered catastrophic losses to their own fighter force, 34% of their strength in January, another 56% in February. These losses included not just aircraft, which could be replaced, but experienced pilots, who could not. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The fundamental problem the Luftwaffe faced was one of mathematics and industrial capacity. Germany, even at the peak of its territorial expansion, could not match the industrial output of the United States. American aircraft production in 1944 exceeded 60,000 planes, including more than 6,500 B-17G models alone. German production, despite the organizational genius of Armaments Minister Albert Speer and the ruthless exploitation of slave labor, could not keep pace. More critically, the Americans had the resources to train pilots properly, giving them hundreds of hours of flight time before sending them to combat. German pilot training programs, desperately trying to replace mounting losses, cut training time to dangerous minimums. Pilots arrived at combat units barely able to fly their aircraft, let alone employ it effectively in combat. The arms race between bomber defensive armament and fighter offensive armament had become a war of attrition, and Germany was losing. Every mission cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable resources. Every mission the Americans flew, regardless of losses, was replaced by new aircraft and new crews flowing across the Atlantic in numbers the Germans could not match. The psychological impact on German pilots was profound. In the early years of the war, Luftwaffe fighter pilots had enjoyed a significant advantage over their opponents. German fighters were generally superior to enemy aircraft. German pilots were better trained. German tactics, developed through combat experience in Spain and refined in Poland and France, were more sophisticated. Fighter pilots were an elite, confident in their skills and their equipment. By 1944, that confidence had evaporated. German pilots now faced American fighters that were equal or superior to their own aircraft, flown by pilots who had the fuel to train properly and the industrial backing to replace losses. And when they managed to evade or fight through the escorts to reach the bombers, they faced aircraft bristling with defensive armament, flying in formations specifically designed to maximize that firepower. The diary entries and letters of German fighter pilots from this period reveal a growing sense of hopelessness. They knew they were losing. They knew that every mission was more likely to be their last. They continued to fight because they were soldiers, because their country was under attack, because they had no choice. But the confident swagger of the early war years was gone, replaced by grim determination and the knowledge that survival was increasingly a matter of luck rather than skill. The American bomber crews, for their part, understood that their defensive armament had not made them invulnerable. Every mission brought losses. Every formation returned with aircraft so badly damaged they would never fly again, with dead and wounded crew members, with hydraulic fluid and fuel streaming from torn lines, with engines feathered and control surfaces shot away. The 50 caliber guns that had seemed so formidable in training were revealed in combat to be necessary but not sufficient. They bought time. They discouraged attacks. They occasionally destroyed enemy fighters, but they did not eliminate the threat. The true measure of the B-17's defensive armament was not in the German fighters it destroyed, but in the missions it allowed American crews to complete. The doctrine of the self-defending bomber formation, so controversial in the pre-war years, proved viable not because it eliminated the need for fighter escort, but because it made unescorted bombing survivable long enough for escorts to be developed and deployed. This distinction is critical. The Americans did not prove their doctrine correct, they proved it workable. There is a profound difference. A correct doctrine would have achieved its objectives without unacceptable losses. The American doctrine of unescorted daylight bombing resulted in casualty rates that, in any previous war, would have been considered catastrophic. The 8th Air Force suffered 47,000 casualties during the war, including 26,000 dead. Some bomb groups had casualty rates exceeding 100%, meaning they lost more men than their authorized strength, as replacements were fed into units to compensate for mounting losses. But the Americans had the industrial capacity and population to sustain these losses while simultaneously developing solutions to reduce them. The British, facing similar losses in daylight bombing earlier in the war, had been forced to switch to night operations because they lacked the resources to sustain the attrition. The Germans, attacking Britain in 1940, had been forced to abandon daylight bombing for the same reason. Only the Americans had the combination of resources, industrial capacity, and strategic depth to persist with daylight operations until the combination of improved defensive armament, better tactics, and long-range escort fighters made those operations sustainable. The final irony of the Luftwaffe's miscalculation about American bomber armament was not that they underestimated the defensive firepower of individual aircraft. German intelligence provided accurate reports on B-17 armament. Field Marshal Milch recognized the threat. The miscalculation was more fundamental. The Germans underestimated American industrial capacity and the American willingness to accept casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. The Luftwaffe had designed its bombers around the assumption that air forces operated within resource constraints, that losses had to be minimized, that doctrine had to reflect the reality of limited industrial capacity. This was a rational assumption based on European experience. Every European power in the war faced resource constraints that shaped their decisions. The British couldn't afford unlimited bomber losses, so they switched to night bombing. The Germans couldn't afford to develop and produce heavy four-engine bombers and maintain production of medium bombers and fighters, so they focused on tactical aviation. The Americans faced different constraints, not unlimited resources, but resources on a scale that dwarfed those available to any European power. When daylight bombing proved costly, the American response was not to abandon the strategy but to build more bombers, train more crews, develop better tactics, and create escort fighters with sufficient range. The famous American saying, "Quantity has a quality all its own," attributed to Stalin but practiced by the United States, captured this approach. The 13 guns on a B-17G were not individually superior to German fighter armament. Collectively, across hundreds of bombers in formation, they created a defensive system that German fighters could not overcome. The human cost of this approach was immense. Consider a single example from countless similar stories. On February 22, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched a mission against aircraft factories in Oschersleben, Germany. The B-17 Jeannie Marie from the 367th Bomb Squadron was hit by flak during the bomb run, damaging the bomb bay doors and causing an engine to leak fluid. As the formation turned for home, German fighters attacked. The crew of Jeannie Marie fought back with everything they had. The top turret gunner, the ball turret gunner, the waist gunners, all firing at the diving Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs. The bombardier in the nose operated his chin turret, tracking targets through shattered plexiglass. The aircraft shuddered under the impact of cannon shells. One engine began smoking. Hydraulic fluid sprayed across the fuselage. But the crew kept fighting, kept firing, kept their aircraft in formation. They made it back to England. The aircraft was so badly damaged it required extensive repairs before it could fly again. But the crew survived. The defensive armament had not prevented the attack. It had not destroyed all the attackers. But it had, combined with the structural toughness of the aircraft and the skill of the crew, kept them alive long enough to reach safety. Multiply this story by thousands, by tens of thousands. Every mission, every formation, crews fighting, dying, surviving, aircraft destroyed, damaged, repaired, sent back into combat. This was the reality of the strategic bombing campaign, far removed from the clean mathematical calculations of pre-war doctrine. The Luftwaffe's miscalculation, then, was not a simple failure to count machine guns. It was a failure to understand that the Americans would build an entire system around the concept of the self-defending bomber, that they would accept horrific casualties as the price of maintaining daylight operations, that they would commit whatever resources necessary to make the doctrine work, even when early results suggested it was failing. By the spring of 1945, the air war over Germany was effectively over. The Luftwaffe still existed, still possessed aircraft and pilots, but could no longer mount effective resistance against the massive bomber streams that now operated almost with impunity over German cities and industrial targets. American and British bombers flew missions in formations of 1,000 or more aircraft, protected by hundreds of escort fighters, facing only sporadic and increasingly ineffective opposition. The Me-262 jet fighter, introduced in the final months of the war, represented what might have been if Germany had possessed the resources and time to develop advanced weapons. Fast enough to outrun any Allied fighter, it could attack bomber formations with relative impunity. But there were too few of them, arriving too late, operated by pilots who lacked fuel for adequate training. The jet fighters scored some victories, but they could not change the outcome. On April 7, 1945, the 8th Air Force launched one of its final major missions, a raid against aircraft factories and jet fighter bases. 1,336 heavy bombers participated, protected by 850 escort fighters. German resistance was minimal. The era of the contested daylight bombing raid was over. The cost had been staggering. The 8th Air Force lost approximately 4,700 heavy bombers during its operations from England. Crew casualties exceeded 47,000, with more than 26,000 killed. Individual bomb groups sometimes suffered losses exceeding 200% of their authorized strength as replacements cycled through the units. Some aircrews completed their required 25 missions and went home. Many more did not. The Luftwaffe's fighter force had been destroyed through attrition. Approximately 70,000 German fighter pilots served during the war. Roughly 28,000 were killed in action, and many thousands more were injured. The life expectancy of a German fighter pilot in 1944 was measured in weeks. By the war's end, the Luftwaffe was sending pilots into combat with less than 100 hours of training against American pilots who had 300 or more hours before they saw combat. What do we conclude from this accounting? That the Americans were right and the Germans wrong? The answer is more nuanced. The American doctrine of the self-defending bomber was not proven correct by the war. It was proven workable, barely, at enormous cost, by a nation with resources sufficient to sustain that cost until other solutions could be implemented. The German doctrine of lightly armed bombers, dependent on speed, maneuverability, and fighter escort, was not necessarily wrong. It failed because Germany lacked the strategic depth, industrial capacity, and air superiority to make it work. German bombers over Britain in 1940 faced the same fundamental problem American bombers over Germany faced in 1943. They could not survive in daylight against determined fighter opposition without suffering unacceptable losses. The difference was that Britain, with American aid, could sustain its war effort until other factors turned the tide. Germany, increasingly isolated and facing enemies on multiple fronts, could not. The 13 machine guns on a B-17G were not a war-winning weapon. They were a component in a system that included industrial production, crew training, tactical development, escort fighters, target selection, and the strategic decision to accept high casualties in pursuit of strategic objectives. Remove any one of these components, and the system fails. The Luftwaffe's miscalculation was not that they failed to put 13 guns on their bombers. Their miscalculation was that they believed air warfare could be conducted within the resource constraints that governed traditional military operations. The Americans proved that with sufficient industrial capacity and willingness to accept casualties, those constraints could be overcome, at least temporarily, and at horrific cost. When Hauptmann Fritz Geischardt died from wounds received attacking an American bomber on August 17, 1943, he represented more than the loss of a skilled pilot. He represented the collision of doctrine with reality, of assumption with evidence. The Luftwaffe had assumed that bombers, regardless of defensive armament, would remain targets rather than threats. The Americans had designed their bombers on a different assumption, that given sufficient firepower, bombers could be both target and threat simultaneously. Both assumptions contained elements of truth and elements of fatal error. The historical record shows not which assumption was correct, but which nation had the resources to make their assumption work long enough for other factors to decide the outcome. In this sense, the story of American bomber defensive armament is not primarily a story about technology or tactics. It is a story about industrial capacity, strategic choices, and the willingness of nations to accept horrific human costs in pursuit of victory. The young men who flew in those bombers, who manned those 13 guns through missions that tested the limits of human endurance, did not fight for vindication of doctrine or demonstration of industrial might. They fought to complete their missions, to protect their crew, to survive to see another day. That they succeeded often enough, at terrible cost, to allow the strategic bombing campaign to achieve its objectives, is testimony not to the genius of pre-war doctrine, but to the courage of men thrust into a war where survival was never guaranteed and victory was purchased with blood. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.